Good evening. Today we're going to be doing a video entirely about Sidechain. I realised that we all use Sidechain in every project, and I use Sidechain in every video I do, but I've never properly delved deep into why and how we use Sidechain properly. And in the process of this, what I did was made a template to make sidechaining as easy and as quick as I possibly could. And I'll show you exactly how I've done that, and I will link the template as well. So first off, what is sidechain? We are using one track to affect another. Let's say we've got this kick and we've got this bass. When we use sidechain, we're using the kick to influence the bass. In this instance, our sidechain generally is going to be volume sidechain. So the level of the bass is constant. And then when the kick comes in, the level of the bass ducks down to get out of the way of the kick. And then it remains constant again. And it remains constant. When the kick comes in, the bass comes down. It's sort of like who's king of the jungle. And in dance music, generally, the kick is the king of the jungle. So when the kick comes in, when the lion comes in, then all of the gazelles and the birds and the other animals disperse. And that means our bass and our synths and maybe even our vocals and maybe even our effects disperse on different levels. It depends how scared you are of the kick. But generally, as a creaky analogy, if kick is the king of the jungle, then every time the kick enters the space, then we're trying to duck other things out to make room for that kick, because the kick, particularly in our low end, is one of the most important parts of the track. Generally, the low end of the frequency spectrum needs this kind of sidechaining, whereas the high end of the frequency spectrum doesn't really need it. You know, if you listen to a song and you hear a vocal and you hear hi-hats and you hear guitars or synths in the high end of the frequency spectrum, you're able to distinguish each different part. And I feel like it's much easier for the ear to pick up individual elements in the higher frequency spectrum. But in the lower frequency spectrum, it's much more difficult. It's almost like if you were to have a conversation with two people at the same time and they're both talking to you, you sort of can only focus on one thing at any one time. And because generally the low end of the frequency spectrum isn't having the sort of same clarity that you have from high end of the frequency spectrum, you really need the low end to be sort of really clear and distinct. So you can't have two basses playing at the same time. I mean, you can, you know, there's no rules. You can do it if you're layering stuff, or if you're playing two separate basses playing next to each other and not overlapping, it can work. But generally, when you're having overlapping instruments playing at the low frequency, it starts to get really disjointed and your ear can't sort of latch on to what is actually being played. It's really difficult to pinpoint what is actually happening musically with these elements. So there's a few ways of going about it. In my previous videos, I've always used Shaperbox, and we're going to still use Shaperbox. One thing I've done, which I have never really done before, is I've created this sidechain group. So if you press Command T and create a new audio track, and we press this in button here, and then what I've done with this group here is I've sent my bass and my guitar, I've sent the output of this to the sidechain group. So if this is the new one that we've just created, we send it to 2 audio. But because I've already done it, we send it to the sidechain group. So now we could effectively rename this guitar and bass group. So if we solo that, and then if we mute that, so it's literally the output of both of these groups here. And the reason this works well is because we can now apply the same sidechain to both of these groups. When you do a change to one of the groups, you don't have to copy and paste it and do it to the other. The whole of the sound sounds more cohesive as well, because everything working as one in and out movement. So I've made this rack, which is 2 instances of Shaperbox, and I've only got 3 macros on there. One is the dry wet, one is the kick time, and one is the snare time. So if we have a little listen to just the kick and the bass to make it easy. So if we take that kick time up, so this knob is only affecting this length in LFO in milliseconds. So depending on the length of your kick or depending on the sort of vibe of your song, you can just change this one knob and you effectively don't have to really worry about anything else. So if we look through an oscilloscope and then change this kick time and see the difference it makes. So when it's at 0, we've got no sidechain at all. And if we got it up at 127, we've got all the sidechain it can possibly do. So the length is much longer. So it's always going to be somewhere in between that. So let's dial it in a little bit. So here we can see this is our kick, and then this is when our bass is being introduced. So at the moment it's pretty extreme, so there's no overlap between the kick and the bass. At the moment it sounds a little bit, doesn't sound very natural, so we can dial that in a little bit lower. So that sounds a little bit more natural to me. And we've only done that with just one knob, which makes it so much easier. And one thing that I've done with this template is I've cut up the lows and the mids. So even if we've got this quite low down, let's say about here, we can see with the low end of the frequency spectrum, so below 250-ish hertz, all of the bass is getting out of the way of the low end information from the kick. So one thing that I'd always recommend is making sure that the low end in this setup, this is where you're carving it out from the kick. So this is where the length of the low end of the kick is existing, and then your bass comes out after this. The mids in some ways doesn't matter so much. It's just up to your ears, I would say. So on this low band, as long as we've got this kick really tight and the bass is coming up after the kick is finished playing out as it has here, then the mids, you can be a bit more free rein with it because we're only affecting 250 hertz and above. So that's where you can have a little bit more clarity. It's not so important that you sort of duck out everything above this frequency. And I've done the same thing with a snare. And if we open that up, our snare time does the exact same thing. So if we take it all the way up, it takes longer for the bass to come back in after the snare has been hit. If we take it all the way down, the time between the snare being hit and the bass coming back in is shorter. So hopefully that makes sidechaining a lot easier for you. If you're only looking at it with just these 3 knobs, generally I would have the dry wet all the way up. But again, that's up to personal preference. Depends on the song that you're making. But if you're only having to rely on these 2 knobs, I think it can make it a lot easier. And using the oscilloscope in Shaperbox really helps, especially with this low end, just to make sure that you're carving out enough space from that kick for the low end. As long as you've made sure you've got that tight, then generally I think you'll be onto a winner. So hopefully that makes sidechaining a lot easier. And thank you for watching. And I do hope it has helped. Love to your mother.